Nobody talks about this, not your doctor, not the health magazines, not the wellness channels that tell you to eat more vegetables and walk more steps. Nobody talks about what loneliness actually does to the brain, not the feeling of it, not the emotional weight of it, not the quiet ache of a house that used to be fuller than it is now, what it physically does, inside the brain, at the cellular level, in ways that show up years later as something your doctor will call by a completely different name. Because here is what the research shows. Chronic loneliness in adults over 70 does not just affect your mood. It shrinks your brain, measurably, documentably, in specific regions, in ways that mirror the early stages of cognitive decline so precisely that the two conditions are frequently confused in clinical assessment. And the 4 foods I am going to give you today are not comfort foods. They are not foods that make you feel better emotionally. They are foods that have been identified in peer-reviewed research as directly addressing the specific biological damage that loneliness produces inside the aging brain. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is not a conversation about feelings. It is a conversation about brain tissue, and brain tissue can be protected, even now, even after years of carrying something nobody told you was doing this much damage. Let me give you the biology. Because the moment you understand what is actually happening inside the brain during chronic loneliness, the urgency of what I am about to share becomes impossible to dismiss. The human brain evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in social groups, not occasionally social, constantly social, deeply interdependent. Survival literally required connection, warmth, protection, food sharing, cooperative childcare. The brain developed a threat detection system specifically calibrated to social disconnection. When that system detects isolation, when it registers that the social connection required for survival is absent or insufficient, it activates the same stress response that physical danger activates. Cortisol floods the system. The inflammatory response escalates. The immune system shifts into a state of chronic low-level activation, not for an hour, not for a day, for as long as the isolation persists. And here is what that chronic stress response does to specific brain structures over months and years. A 2010 study from the University of Chicago found that chronically lonely adults showed significantly elevated cortisol levels throughout the day and night compared to socially connected peers. Not just during stressful moments, continuously, around the clock. Elevated cortisol at that level does something specific and measurable to the hippocampus, the brain region most critical for memory formation and most vulnerable to stress-related damage. It shrinks it. A 2019 study published in Nature Neuroscience found that socially isolated older adults showed measurably reduced hippocampal volume compared to socially connected peers of the same age, not older peers, same age peers. The difference in brain volume was produced not by years, but by isolation. But the damage does not stop at the hippocampus. Chronic loneliness also accelerates the degradation of myelin, the protective sheath around nerve fibers that allows signals to travel efficiently between brain regions. Remember from our earlier conversation about B12, myelin is the insulation around your brain's wiring. Loneliness degrades it through a specific inflammatory pathway involving a compound called IL-6, interleukin-6, an inflammatory cytokine that rises dramatically in chronically isolated adults and directly attacks myelin integrity, slower signal transmission, reduced cognitive efficiency, the fog that many older adults attribute to aging. Often, it is loneliness, wearing an aging face. And there is one more mechanism. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making, emotional regulation, and impulse control, shows measurably reduced activity in chronically lonely adults, which means that loneliness does not just make you sad. It reduces your capacity to manage sadness. It impairs the very brain region that would help you reach out, make decisions, take action, creating a neurological trap. The more isolated you are, the less capacity you have to end the isolation. Not because you are weak. Because your brain is working against you. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know who is watching this video. You may be someone who lost a spouse, who raised children who now live far away, who retired from a career that provided daily human contact and found the silence of home louder than you expected. You may be someone whose social world has contracted quietly over the last decade, not dramatically, not because of any single event, but through the slow accumulation of losses and distances and changes that nobody warned you would add up to this. You may be someone who would never describe themselves as lonely, who has a family, who has neighbors, who goes to church or to the market or to the clinic, but who has not felt genuinely known, genuinely seen and understood by another person, in longer than you want to admit. The research does not require complete social isolation to produce these effects. It requires chronic insufficient connection, the kind that is entirely possible to live inside while surrounded by people. And it is more common in adults over 70 than any other demographic on Earth. A 2018 survey by the Kaiser Family Foundation found that 22% of adults in the United States reported feeling lonely or socially isolated always or often. Among adults over 65, that figure rose to 43%, nearly half, sitting with damage accumulating inside their brains that their doctors are not testing for and their families may not be able to see. This video is for them. It is for you. And the 4 foods I am about to give you are not a replacement for human connection. Please hear that clearly. They are a biological buffer, something that addresses the specific damage at the cellular level while you do the harder, more important work of rebuilding the human connections that your brain was designed to need. Before I give you the 4 foods, I want to tell you about something that matters deeply to what we are discussing today. I have compiled a book called The 50 Forgotten Remedies the Modern World Wants You to Ignore. That book are remedies, nutritional, herbal, and practical, that address the specific biological conditions that modern medicine has been slowest to connect to their root causes. The damage loneliness does to the brain is one of those conditions. The foods I am about to share with you are documented in that broader context. The link is in the description below. Hey, what it is worth to you. Now, the 4 foods. Each one of these foods addresses a specific biological mechanism of loneliness-related brain damage. This is not general brain health advice. This is targeted, specific, matched to the exact pathways the research identifies as most damaged by chronic social isolation in adults over 70. Food 1. Wild-caught fatty fish, for myelin repair. The myelin degradation produced by chronic loneliness-related inflammation requires specific raw materials to repair. The most critical of those materials is DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, the omega-3 fatty acid that comprises the structural fat of brain cell membranes and is the primary building block of myelin. A 2016 study from the University of Illinois found that older adults with higher blood levels of DHA showed significantly better myelin integrity on brain imaging compared to those with lower levels, regardless of age. Regardless of age. The myelin was better maintained not because of how old they were, but because of what they were eating. Wild-caught salmon, mackerel, sardines, herring, 2 to 3 servings per week, wild-caught specifically. The DHA content of farmed fish is dramatically lower, and the inflammatory omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is reversed. If fish is difficult to access consistently, a high-quality fish oil supplement providing at least 1,000 mg of combined EPA and DHA daily is the evidence-backed alternative. But food first. Always food first. Food 2. Dark leafy greens, for hippocampal protection. Hippocampal shrinkage produced by chronic cortisol elevation requires 2 specific nutritional interventions. The first is folate, vitamin B9. which is required for the methylation processes that regulate cortisol metabolism and protect hippocampal neurons from stress-related damage. The second is lutein, a carotenoid antioxidant that accumulates specifically in brain tissue and has been shown in multiple studies to protect hippocampal neurons from inflammatory damage. Both are found in extraordinary concentrations in dark leafy greens, spinach, kale, Swiss chard, collard greens. A 2018 study from Rush University Medical Center found that adults who consumed at least one serving of leafy greens daily showed cognitive performance equivalent to adults 11 years younger than their chronological age 11 years younger, from one serving of greens per day, 1 cup of cooked spinach daily. In olive oil, always in olive oil, which dramatically increases the absorption of the fat-soluble lutein from the greens. For your Caribbean and West African audience, callaloo, moringa leaves, and bitter leaf are among the most lutein-dense greens available and significantly more accessible than kale in many communities. Your traditional greens are not inferior alternatives. They are superior sources. Food 3. Eggs for neurotransmitter restoration. The prefrontal cortex suppression produced by chronic loneliness involves a specific neurotransmitter deficit. Acetylcholine, the primary neurotransmitter of attention, decision-making, and emotional regulation, is synthesized from choline. And choline is one of the most consistently deficient nutrients in adults over 65, not because the diet lacks eggs. Because eggs, specifically egg yolks, were removed from millions of older adults' diets over the past 4 decades on the advice of dietary guidelines, we now know were built on flawed science. 2 whole eggs daily, yolk included, provides approximately 250 to 300 mg of choline. Roughly half the daily requirement for adults over 70. A 2019 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that higher choline intake in older adults was directly associated with better performance on tests of executive function, the cognitive domain most damaged by loneliness-related prefrontal suppression. The yolk is not the enemy. It is the medicine, soft-cooked, gently heated, every morning. Food 4. Fermented foods for the gut-brain inflammatory axis. This is the most recent and perhaps most significant piece of the loneliness-brain damage puzzle. The research on the gut-brain axis, the bidirectional communication pathway between the gut microbiome and the brain, has produced findings that are transforming how researchers understand both loneliness and cognitive decline. Here is the specific mechanism. Chronic loneliness elevates IL-6, the inflammatory cytokine that degrades myelin, through a pathway that runs directly through the gut microbiome. Social isolation disrupts the diversity and health of the gut microbiome within weeks. A disrupted microbiome produces more inflammatory compounds. Those compounds travel via the vagus nerve to the brain. They elevate IL-6. They accelerate myelin degradation. The loneliness to brain damage pathway runs through the gut, which means that restoring gut microbiome health is not just a digestive intervention. It is a neuroprotective one. A 2021 study published in Nature Microbiology found that older adults with higher gut microbiome diversity showed significantly lower levels of inflammatory markers, including IL-6, and better cognitive outcomes than those with low diversity. Fermented foods are the most accessible and most effective dietary intervention for microbiome restoration available. Full-fat plain yogurt with live cultures. Kefir. Sauerkraut, not in vinegar, which kills the cultures. Fermented vegetables of any kind. 1 serving daily. Consistent. Every day. Because the gut does not maintain its microbiome diversity without regular input, and the brain cannot afford the inflammation that follows when it does not. Here is what to add to your eating this week. Not a complete dietary overhaul, 4 specific additions. targeted to the 4 damage mechanisms: wild-caught fatty fish 2 to 3 times per week. For myelin repair, 1 cup of dark leafy greens daily, cooked in olive oil. For hippocampal protection, 2 whole eggs every morning, yolk included. For neurotransmitter restoration, 1 serving of fermented food daily, yogurt, kefir, or fermented vegetables. For gut-brain inflammation reduction. These 4 foods working together address every biological mechanism through which chronic loneliness damages the aging brain. They do not replace human connection, but they protect the brain that connection will return to. They keep the structure intact while the rebuilding happens. I want to tell you about 2 people. The first, I will call her Evelyn, 74 years old. Originally from Trinidad, living in Canada, Evelyn had been widowed for 6 years when her daughter noticed the changes. Not dramatic changes, quiet ones. The kind that accumulates slowly enough that nobody points to a single moment and says, "There." That is when it started. She was slower to respond in conversation. She lost words mid-sentence more often than she used to. She seemed to be somewhere slightly behind the present moment, present enough to function, but not quite fully there. Her doctor assessed her and used words like age-related cognitive changes and normal for her stage. Her daughter was not satisfied. She began researching the connection between grief, isolation, and brain health. She found the loneliness brain damage research. She did not tell her mother the full picture immediately. She simply started cooking differently, sardines twice a week, callaloo every day in olive oil, eggs every morning. Kefir was added to her mother's breakfast. 8 weeks later, Evelyn finished a sentence she had started. Her daughter did not say anything. She simply reached across the table and held her mother's hand. 4 months later, Evelyn joined a church choir she had been avoiding since her husband died. Not because the food cured her grief, because her brain had enough of what it needed to make the decision her grief had been preventing. The second, I will call him Nathaniel, 70 years old, Ghanaian background. Living in London, Nathaniel had retired from a career that had been his primary social world for 35 years. Within 18 months of retirement, his world had contracted to his flat, his television, and the weekly phone call from his son in Accra. He described himself as fine. His son described him as disappearing. Nathaniel began the 4-food protocol not because he understood neuroscience, but because his son asked him to try it after watching a video on this channel. He was skeptical. He was also lonely enough to try anything. 3 months later, Nathaniel called his son on a Tuesday. Not the scheduled Sunday call, a Tuesday to tell him about something he had read, something he found interesting, something he wanted to share. His son told me that Tuesday's phone call was the moment he knew his father was coming back, not all the way back, but back enough to call on a Tuesday. That is what 4 foods and 3 months did, not a miracle. Biology, working the way it was always designed to work when it is given what it needs. I want to say something important before we close. The loneliness epidemic among adults over 70 is real. It is documented. It is global. It is producing measurable brain damage in millions of people who are being told their symptoms are simply aging. And it is not being addressed at the level it deserves, not by healthcare systems, not by governments, not by the medical culture that is quick to name the downstream consequences, the cognitive decline, the depression, the increased mortality, but slow to address the upstream cause. You cannot medicate loneliness. You cannot prescribe connection. But you can protect the brain that loneliness is damaging while the harder work of rebuilding connection happens. That is what these 4 foods do. And that protection, that biological buffering, may be the difference between a brain that can still reach out when the opportunity for connection arrives and one that has been too damaged by isolation to recognize it. Feed your brain, so your brain can help you find your way back. Before this video ends, think of one person. Not someone who is visibly struggling, not someone who has named what they are carrying, someone who has simply gone quieter than they used to be, who calls less often, who declines invitations more often, who seems to be slowly withdrawing from the edges of their own life. Share this video with them today, not as a diagnosis, as a door that says, someone understands what this does. Someone has taken it seriously enough to research it. Someone has found something that might help. Give this video a like. Subscribe to the Hidden Truths Life, because your brain is worth protecting. At 70, at 75, at 80, at every age, that loneliness has had the nerve to show up uninvited. The 50 forgotten remedies the modern world wants you to ignore, linked in the description, because this is one remedy. There are 49 more waiting for you. The end.